Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about something beautifully simple and quietly terrifying: sleep. Specifically, why entire tribes used to sleep in perfect circles, and what exactly they were trying to keep out. From families huddled around fires while lions prowled just beyond the glow, to Arctic hunters arranging their tents like the spokes of a frozen wheel, to nights where silence itself was suspicious, so someone always had to stay awake. These weren't bedtime stories. They were blueprints for survival. If that already sounds a little too relatable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this sort of strange, sleepless anthropology. I promise I won't take it personally if you prefer to remain ignorant of prehistoric interior design. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Because somewhere out there, it's still dark, and someone's probably keeping the fire alive. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, or just sit somewhere warm. Let the room go quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet where you start hearing the small sounds of the night. Because that's where our story begins. In a circle of light, surrounded by everything waiting in the dark. Night was never peaceful in the way modern people like to imagine it, some poetic hush under a velvet sky. The stars sparkling, the campfire crackling politely. No, for most of human history, night was a hostile takeover. The light died, and with it, your sense of control. Every shadow became a rumor, every sound a negotiation with something that probably had sharper teeth than you. The darkness wasn't romantic, it was an ecological democracy in which you, soft and furless, were at the bottom of the ballot. Out on the open plains, where the horizon never shut up about how small you were. The dark wasn't empty, it was full. Lions prowled in Africa, jaguars in the Amazon, wolves in the northern steppes. The air itself carried eyes. To sleep was to volunteer for temporary death, to surrender the one thing your ancestors had learned to weaponize: awareness. So people adapted. They didn't just close their eyes and hope for the best, they engineered sleep like it was a military operation. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, anthropologists noticed that even today, someone is always awake. Sleep rotates like a silent watchtower. When one person stirs, another settles. The group never collectively drops into unconsciousness. It's as if the night is an enemy that must be distracted with movement and murmurs. The San of the Kalahari, the Ruhonzi, the Inuit, the Plains tribes each developed their own choreography for survival. A kind of defensive ballet performed on dirt, ice, or grass. Sleeping alone, after all, was a death wish. The cold could suffocate faster than any predator, and being isolated made you less a person and more a midnight snack. So people gathered. They huddled close, not from sentiment but from thermodynamics and sheer common sense. To sleep near others was to build a human firewall. It didn't guarantee safety, but it gave the illusion of it tanned. Illusions, in the dark, were worth more than firewood. Even the fires themselves were more fragile than they seemed. They offered warmth, yes, but also a problem. They announced your location. To light a fire was to whisper to the wilderness, "We're right here, don't mind the smell of roasted meat," yet no one dared extinguish it. Because cold kills slower, but it kills for certain. So every flame became both a lure and a lifeline, a negotiation with the predators watching from just beyond the orange glow. The night's logic was brutal but simple. If you wanted to wake up, you needed company. And so, across continents, humans instinctively fell into circles. They faced one another, wrapped in hides or furs or the rough exhale of sleep. The circle was not aesthetic, it was insurance. A primitive algorithm written in muscle memory long before anyone could spell strategy. It said, stay close, stay seen, stay alive. Even the animals understood it. A herd of antelope, a flock of geese, a troop of primates each tucked itself into a ring before resting. The first architecture, before walls and roofs, was this shared geometry of fear and warmth. A shape that said, we're surrounded, but at least we're surrounded together. And from that circle of light and breath, civilization slowly began to emerge, not as comfort, but as organized paranoia with better sleeping arrangements. Before anyone thought to build houses or carve gods, there was the circle. Not the perfect mathematical one people later worshipped with compasses and stone temples, but the messy, humankind drawn by footsteps in the dirt, measured by the distance between heartbeats and fear. It wasn't planned. It happened naturally. the way people and animals always seem to fold into the same shape when safety becomes a team project. In the archaeological record, the earliest camps we've found Neolithic, Mesolithic, take your pick were circles. In Siberia, mammoth bone huts were arranged that way 15,000 years ago, each shelter facing inward, like members of a council who couldn't afford to mistrust each other. Plains tribes did the same millennia later, setting their tipis in precise rings with the entrance always to the east, so the rising sun poured through like divine housekeeping. When you live under a sky that doesn't come with walls, geometry becomes your security system. It wasn't just the Americas or the Arctic. Across Africa, among the Maasai and the Himba, circular kraals and enclosures still hold the same logic. Animals and people sleep in a shared ring, fences on the outside, fire in the middle, everything alive inside the loop. It's not aesthetic, minimalism, it's a biological blueprint. The circle gives everyone equal sight lines and no one the disadvantage of a corner. Corners, after all, are for things that hide. Anthropologists like to say this was the first kind of architecture because it didn't just shelter the body, it organized behavior. You always knew where you belonged in the ring, who sat by the fire, who guarded the edge, who told stories, and who snored loud enough to be mistaken for thunder. It turned chaos into choreography. No blueprints, no property lines, no interior design, just an unspoken rule. Face inward, trust the middle. The Lakota called their encampment Oseti Sakowin, the 7 council fires, each tribe symbolized by one flame, together forming a cosmic circle of kinship. The structure of their camp wasn't a matter of convenience, it was cosmology. The center represented the living heart of creation, the perimeter its guardians. The village was both map and prayer, drawn on the earth every evening and erased every dawn. The circular formation wasn't superstition, it was survival, expressed through symmetry. But even outside spirituality, there was a physics to it. When the wind tore across the plains or the tundra, circular camps resisted collapse. They distributed pressure evenly, the same reason round igloos stand longer than square houses of snow. The wind flows, and the shape yields without breaking nature's own engineering degree. Somewhere, long before pyramids and palaces, a cold, tired hunter probably discovered this by accident, realized it worked, and didn't bother explaining. He just did it again the next night. What's beautiful and quietly hilarious is how the same formation that once kept predators out later became the blueprint for ceremony, gathering, and governance. The fire that used to scare away hyenas turned into a meeting place for elders and storytellers. The circle became a symbol of equality and belonging, mostly because everyone had the same view of the flames and the same amount of smoke in their eyes. And when people began to move from place to place, herders, traders, nomads, they carried that pattern in muscle memory. Even temporary camps repeated the same ritual. Ring of bodies, ring of huts, ring of trust. Safety, it turned out, had a shape, and that shape followed them, glowing faintly across millennia, like an instinct that never quite unlearned the dark. If the circle began as geometry, it survived as central heating. Before insulation, before fleece, before the luxury of sleeping alone without freezing to death. There was the miracle of shared body heat. Anthropologists studying the Hadza, the Inuit, or the Iwenki could tell you, the most reliable energy source in the prehistoric world wasn't firewood, it was other people. Cold, after all, is democratic. It doesn't care if you're a hunter, a mother, or the village shaman with fancy feathers. When the wind howls and the ground breathes frost, everyone becomes livestock huddling for warmth. The Hadza in Tanzania, sleeping under open skies, still instinctively pull closer in the early hours when the temperature drops, creating small concentric clusters of bodies like ripples around a fire. It's not affection, it's thermoregulation. Tenderness was a side effect evolution accidentally rewarded. Children and elders, those least able to generate or retain heat, were positioned near the center, swaddled between adults like embers protected from the wind. Among the Inuit, infants often slept skin to skin with their mothers under caribou furs, an ancient version of central heating powered by metabolism and maternal stubbornness. The plains tribes of North America placed their tipis close together, hides overlapping just enough to trap warm air but leave gaps for smoke to escape. Efficiency disguised as intimacy. And if one thinks that primitive life was uncomfortable, consider this. In many cases, it was warmer. A ring of sleeping humans, pressed shoulder to shoulder, generates more heat than most modern sleeping bags. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic camps shows traces of ash and charcoal positioned between sleeping spaces, fires deliberately distributed so no side of the circle ever grew cold. Warmth was a collective achievement, not a private possession. In communal societies, temperature shaped etiquette. No one owned heat alone. Even in Africa's drier climates, where nights could chill unexpectedly, groups shared coverings, cloaks, or animal skins. The Himba of Namibia, who still coat their skin in red ochre mixed with fat, maintain warmth and insect protection, at once a chemical echo of older, colder nights. And if someone wandered from the circle, their absence was felt, not just emotionally but physically. The air literally grew colder. Of course, there was strategy hidden under all that warmth. Huddling reduced not only heat loss but also exposure to predators. Lions don't like a moving, breathing wall of people. Wolves hesitate before a mass of scent and sound. The circle smelled confusing, sounded alive, and radiated heat like a miniature sun. Predators preferred an easy dinner, not a communal one. But warmth wasn't only physical. Around the fire, the circle became the night's pulse. People talked in whispers, shared food, sang, repaired tools. Warmth blurred into intimacy, and intimacy into memory. Anthropologists observing hunter-gatherer nights have noted that these hours, half asleep, half dreaming, were when myths were born, when warmth and exhaustion dissolved the line between the human and the divine. It's no coincidence that so many origin stories begin at night, around a fire, inside a circle. Heat softened the edges of fear, and fear softened into story. In that fragile warmth, humanity began to imagine itself as something more than prey, something capable of shaping the dark instead of just surviving it. And in the center of it all, the fire glowed, the same way it always had, both guardian and witness, the burning heart of the circle itself. Every circle needs a reason to stay closed, and for most human groups, that reason burned at its center. Fire wasn't just light, it was the original authority figure, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Long before gods had names or temples, fire was the only deity that answered every night without fail, demanding fuel, reverence, and a safe distance. Archaeologists can date hearths older than writing, older even than most forms of language. The oldest ones, like those found in South Africa's Wonderwork cave, about 1 million years old, weren't placed randomly. They were carefully tended and often central, as though people instinctively knew that light doesn't belong in the corner. Fire was both literal and symbolic gravity. Everything living orbited around it. For the Plains tribes, fire was treated as the heartbeat of the camp. The Lakota kept the sacred fire of each household alive, its smoke a bridge between the human and the divine. In the Arctic, the Inuits' seal oil lamps were both light source and family shrine. Each flame had a name, and women tended them like one tends the continuity of the world. Even in ancient Europe, hearth goddesses like Hestia or Vesta carried echoes of that same instinct, that where fire burns, life remains civilized. Anthropologists have noticed that firelight does something odd to the human brain. It lowers heart rates, slows breathing, and nudges the mind into that trance between wakefulness and dream. That's where storytelling was born. The flicker of flames gave movement to imagination. Shadows on the rock walls became ancestors, gods, or animals, depending on how long you stared and how much smoke you'd inhaled. The fire didn't just warm the circle, it projected the first cinema, but there was hierarchy in that glow. The person controlling the fire, the one who fed it, decided when to dim it, when to move it, often held quiet authority. In the Plains camp, firekeepers were appointed, responsible not just for warmth, but for the moral temperature of the group. Among the San, the fire was the place where disputes were settled. Laughter returned, and sometimes, trance dances began. The flame was mediator and judge, unpredictable, glowing, always demanding to be watched. Even its sound mattered. Crackling wood was the night's heartbeat, irregular but soothing, a reminder that something alive still answered the dark. The circle faced inward because the fire was the only stable thing left when the world outside froze or hunted or howled. Every ember was both tool and symbol, destroyer and protector, the thing that devoured to keep everything else alive. And yet, for all its warmth, the fire was never owned. It belonged to the group, but also to itself. To let it die was unthinkable. To walk away from it was dangerous. People learned early that fire was like trust, easy to lose, harder to rebuild, and best tended in company. As the fire burned through the night, people slept around it like planets in orbit, each soul tracing a small, invisible path within the larger cycle of light and shadow. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the glow, the dark still waited, full of teeth and patience. The thing about sleeping in the wild is that you never really sleep. You drift, you listen with half a brain, the other half quietly planning your funeral just in case. Long before anyone had door locks or motion sensors, humans invented the original alarm system, the circular camp, a living perimeter made of breath, bone, and paranoia. Predators don't politely knock, they test the edges. A brush in the grass, a shift in the wind, a sound that's not quite natural. That's all it takes to wake a dozen people at once. And that's exactly how the system worked. The Hadza, the San, and the Plains tribes all used the same basic logic. If one person heard something, everyone heard it. The circular formation amplified small noises inward, turning each sleeper into a link in a nocturnal nervous system. A single gasp could ripple through the camp like an electric current. Anthropologists who camped with the Hadza noticed that no one's REM cycle lasted long. People took turns drifting in and out, unconsciously timed, so that the camp was never entirely asleep. It's a strange, unspoken choreography, one that mirrors how meerkats, monkeys, and even some birds maintain constant vigilance through staggered rest. Humanity didn't invent the night watch. It just perfected it through anxiety. Predator encounters weren't hypothetical. Lions, hyenas, and leopards didn't care about social order. For groups in the African savanna or the North American plains, nights were active hours for everything with claws or hunger. And so, the circular camp became both deterrent and trap. Predators circling outside saw only shadows moving around firelight, dozens of human shapes shifting, coughing, whispering. To an opportunistic hunter, that was confusion. Confusion, in the wild, is deadly. On the steppes of Central Asia, nomads still sleep in rings, horses tethered on the outer edge. A restless horse becomes the first alarm, snorting before danger even appears. The same principle applied to the Plains Indians' camps. Dogs, half pets, half security guards roamed the perimeter, barking at anything that rustled. The human circle was layered defense. Animals, then people, then fire. A biological fortress. And while we romanticize these arrangements now, the logic was brutally practical. You didn't want to be the person sleeping on the outside. That was the edge of the world, one step from becoming an anecdote in the morning. Children and elders slept near the center, insulated by youth and loyalty. Warriors or hunters took the outer edge, because bravery looks better than survival guilt. The system worked because fear was evenly distributed. Predator detection wasn't only visual or auditory, it was social. Every community had its version of "don't ignore that sound." Some cultures burned resin or herbs with strong smells that confused approaching animals. Others scattered ashes or bones around the edge to mark human territory. The camp didn't just exist in nature, it announced itself, saying, "This space is taken, and we bite back." Even silence was weaponized. Among the San, sudden quiet could wake everyone faster than a scream. It meant the crickets had stopped, the wind had shifted, or someone's instincts had gone cold. People didn't need words to know danger. They just needed the wrong kind of stillness. And if, by some miracle, the night passed without incident, dawn arrived not as peace but as proof of collective competence. You woke up, stretched, and looked around at everyone still breathing. Not gratitude exactly, but a small, shared triumph over everything that had decided not to eat you. At some point, humans realized they weren't the only ones doing it. Circles, that is. Wildebeests did it. Musk oxen did it. Even flamingos, in their absurd pink choreography, instinctively clumped together when danger approached. Herd animals, flock animals, anything with a pulse, and a predator eventually, discovered that the safest shape in the wild wasn't a line or a square. It was a loop, a geometry of mutual dependence. Humans, despite all the ego, were never far from that instinct. Watch an aerial photo of a prehistoric camp, or even a modern refugee settlement, and the pattern's the same. Concentric rings of necessity. The anthropologists call it spatial organization. The animals would call it staying alive. When humans gathered their shelters, around a common fire, they were doing exactly what antelope and seals do when they press flank too. flank using each other as barricades against whatever wants a midnight snack. Among the plains tribes, warriors often slept on the outermost ring, with the tipis of families toward the center, an echo of the way caribou arrange themselves. Strong males outside, calves inside. It's not hierarchy, it's physics. The outside absorbs impact so the inside can breathe. And though the humans probably told grand stories about honor and guardianship, what they were really performing was zoological choreography in leather and bone. Even the way groups moved mirrored herds. The San, trekking across desert flats, spread out during the day but condensed tightly at night, a pulse of contraction and expansion, like lungs of the savannah. Arctic nomads did the same across tundra. The herd shrinks to endure the dark, expands again at dawn. You could almost chart it like a heartbeat, collective, rhythmic, alive. And just as herds rely on constant awareness, so did people. One member's fear became everyone's cue. A sudden movement, a child waking, a dog stirring, a hunter turning over, rippled across the camp like dominoes of vigilance. There's something absurdly poetic about it. Humanity's early nervous system was external, wired not through neurons but through trust. The idea of individuality, that cherished modern invention, didn't really exist here. To survive the night, you had to dissolve into the group, become another warm link in the mammalian chain. You didn't own your space was defined by the bodies next to you. The shared pulse meant that even while you slept, part of you was awake because everyone else was. It's humbling. In a way, how much of that instinct lingers. Even now, people gather in circles around campfires, concerts, protests, or family dinners, unconsciously resurrecting the herd. Stadiums, amphitheaters, and theaters all repeat the same pattern. Eyes focused inward, energy flowing toward a single center. The architecture of belonging hasn't changed, only the predators have. Scientists studying human sleep cycles found something telling. Our brains still wake slightly at unfamiliar noises, even in locked bedrooms. The herd may have shrunk to one, but the ancient vigilance remains. You can thank your ancestors, and perhaps a few saber-toothed cats, for that restless, suspicious twitch at 3 a.m. Humans like to imagine they rose above animal behavior, but most of our brilliance is just well-decorated instinct. The circle, the closeness, the quiet shuffling at night. It wasn't culture yet. It was survival written in fur and firelight. And if someone ever complained about the smell of too many bodies or the snoring, well, evolution didn't offer soundproof walls, only safety in numbers. If you wanted to find the soul of a nomadic camp, you didn't look at the fire, you looked at who slept closest to it. In almost every society that lived under the open sky, from the Arctic tundra to the Kalahari dunes, the center of the circle was reserved for the fragile and the revered children, mothers, elders, and anyone who wasn't likely to outrun a lion at short notice. It was the safest place in a world that didn't promise safety. Among the plains tribes, infants in cradleboards were often placed close enough to the fire that mothers could reach out without rising, while older siblings curled beside them, swaddled in hides that smelled of smoke and sleep. In the Arctic, the Chukchi and Inuit built snow shelters or skin tents in circles, tucking elders toward the back, away from the draft, where their stories would leak into dreams. The arrangement wasn't sentimental, it was every sleeping body was part of the night's architecture, an organic wall built from hierarchy and care. To lie near the center was to be protected but also observed. The elderly, with their slow breath and steady murmurs, were the camp's metronome, the rhythmic proof that the world hadn't ended yet. Children slept to the sound of that breathing, unconsciously learning the cadence of belonging. And though the center seemed restful, it carried its own weight. The old guarded the young not with weapons, but with vigilance, eyes fluttering open at every crackle, every gust. In the human circle, tenderness was a full-time security job. This wasn't charity, it was efficiency disguised as virtue. The young carried the tribe's future, and the elders carried its memory. Losing either meant erasing a piece of continuity. So the camp rotated protection inward. Hunters slept near the perimeter, facing out toward the noise. Women, infants, and elders clustered near the fire. It was an unspoken equation. Whoever had the most to lose slept deepest in the circle's warmth. The pattern repeats everywhere. The Hadza keep toddlers near the central flames, but teenagers drift toward the edge, apprenticing for vigilance. The Mongolian herders once positioned grandparents beside newborns. their shared body heat balancing youth and age, both prone to losing it fastest. And in desert nights, where temperatures fall like a punishment, the middle became a human furnace, a place where warmth, breath, and myth blended together. Even burial practices echoed the same geometry. In many early cultures, the dead were placed at the center of settlement rings, a reminder that the heart of the group, whether alive or gone, always stayed enclosed. The living and the dead shared the same layout, because safety, it seemed, extended beyond pulse and bone. There's something deeply ironic about how this instinct, arranging life by vulnerability, has outlasted empires. Modern cities still have this pattern, only inverted. The powerful sleep in gated enclaves while the fragile live on the edge, where the cold and danger wait. In the old days, at least the logic was honest. Keep the heart where it's warmest, let the strong handle the dark. Back then, protection wasn't abstract. It was measured by distance to the fire, by whose shadow fell across yours when you slept. The closer you were to the center, the more the circle confessed its priorities. And as dawn crept in, slow, gray, forgiving, the formation loosened, bodies stretching, smoke rising, life continuing. The hunters would move to the edge again. The elders would stir the embers, and the children, blinking against the morning light, would grow up believing that safety was round. The circle didn't just keep out lions and frostbite. It kept out something far less predictable, the invisible. Across continents and centuries, people agreed on one thing: spirits don't travel in circles. They move in straight lines, like arrows, like wind, like bad intentions. And that, supposedly, is why they could never cross a boundary shaped like eternity. Among the plains tribes, the circle carried spiritual weight as much as tactical logic. The Lakota spoke of mitakuoyas, in all things connected, and arranged their camps as a reflection of the universe itself, where everything living and dying orbited around a sacred center. But beneath that beauty was fear. The circle didn't just symbolize connection, it was a containment field. The fire in the middle wasn't decoration, it was a burning exorcism, a reminder to whatever wandered in the dark that this light already belonged to the living. Anthropologists working with the San and Hadza have noted similar beliefs. Spirits, ghosts, or ancestral presences were thought to roam freely at night, curious or hungry. Sleeping in a ring, everyone facing inward, created both visibility and symmetry was, to early humans, divine order. Disorder was where evil crept in. The circle, therefore, wasn't superstition. It was geometry weaponized against chaos. Even in Arctic camps, where the wind itself could sound like the dead whispering through sealskin walls, people believed in enclosing space. The Inuit would sometimes draw protective arcs with soot or blood around sleeping places to confuse wandering souls. Circles weren't just made of tents and stones, they were traced in ritual gestures, in songs repeated softly to remind the unseen that boundaries existed. The same idea appeared in Africa, Australia, and the Americas. The round hut, the ring-shaped village, the dance that spirals inward. Every motion repeated the same argument, that the world is circular, and therefore safe. The Maasai built kraals in circles not only to guard livestock, but to keep their spiritual energy contained. In Aboriginal Australia, sacred sites and sand drawings formed concentric rings, invitations to the gods, warnings to everything else. It's easy now to call that symbolic, but the truth is, it worked. The circle wasn't only psychological comfort, it was behavioral reinforcement. If everyone believed the shape protected them, they acted as though it did. Calm, vigilant, united. Fear, divided, destroys a group. Fear, enclosed, becomes faith. Even the fire's glow played its part. Step outside the circle, and you vanished. The darkness beyond the boundary became its own afterlife, a world of eyes, spirits, and whatever stories your ancestors didn't finish telling. Inside, though the world was contained, the circle defined where meaning ended and mystery began. The more one looks across the human record, the more absurdly consistent it becomes. The oldest temples, the oldest dances, even the oldest burial sites all circle something. A stone, a flame, a silence. We've been drawing halos around our fear since before we had names for it. And perhaps that's the strange genius of it. The realization that protection doesn't always come from building walls. Sometimes it comes from standing together, tracing a line around yourselves, and quietly daring the dark to cross it. For most of history, the concept of a good night's sleep would have sounded suspicious. Too quiet, too long, too trusting. The ancestors didn't sleep. They took turns negotiating with darkness. Every camp had its rhythm, the whisper of footsteps, the shuffle of someone adding wood to the fire, the creak of hide against hide. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a relay. Among the Hadza, the night still functions this way. There's no schedule, no hierarchy, no official night guard, yet someone is always awake. Anthropologists tracking sleep patterns found that during an 8-hour period, at least one member of the group has open eyes 99% of the time. It's not coordination, it's instinct. Like a flock of birds taking turns glancing skyward, humans evolved to rest in shifts without ever agreeing to it. The San of the Kalahari had an unofficial system to older women, often the lightest sleepers, handled the early hours, feeding the fire and muttering to themselves like benevolent insomniacs. The hunters woke before dawn, long before anyone else, to check the wind and tracks. Children, of course, were blissfully useless, which is precisely why they were kept in the warm middle, so no one had to chase them if a hyena got ideas. In the Arctic, the Inuit alternated watch duties by practicality. Whoever's bladder demanded attention became the next sentry. The act of stepping outside to relieve oneself became an early warning patrol. You'd glance across the snow, listen for cracks or distant sled dogs, then return to whisper what you heard or didn't. Civilization, it turns out, may have begun as an elaborate bathroom schedule. The Plains tribes took a more formal approach. Warriors of certain societies, like the Akatita among the Lakota, maintained order through discipline and watchkeeping. Even when encamped, their role didn't end. They were the outer eyes, trained to recognize patterns in sound, the difference between wind through grass and feet through silence. A misplaced noise could wake 100 people faster than any alarm clock ever invented. But not all watchers were military. In many groups, the night was also a time for healers or elders to work. The San healers' trance dances often began after dusk, when the heat dropped and the boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. While others slept, these figures maintained another kind of vigilance, spiritual, atmospheric, almost bureaucratic in its responsibility to keep the universe properly balanced until dawn. And this rotation wasn't just about safety, it was social glue. Sharing the watch meant sharing vulnerability, learning who snored, who muttered, who always woke at the smallest sound. Those subtle habits created intimacy. You didn't need to talk about trust when you'd both survived the same night. What's curious is how the human body still remembers. Even in modern cities, night shift workers show patterns eerily similar to those ancient rotations. Staggered alertness, light sleep, short dreams. The ancestral algorithm never really switched off. It just swapped hyenas for deadlines. You looked around the circle and counted the same faces, noted the same smoke curling from the fire, and felt that fleeting, unspoken relief. Once again, the system had worked. The invisible schedule had held. The night had been managed, not defeated. Because no matter how peaceful the dark looked, everyone knew the rule. Someone always had to stay awake to remind the universe that humans were still here, still breathing, still inconveniently alive. When the fire finally settled into that low, steady hum, the kind that glows more than it burns, something remarkable happened. People started talking, not the frantic kind of talk that fills daylight, but the slow, hypnotic storytelling that only surfaces when darkness presses close and there's nowhere to be but together. The night became the oldest classroom, the first theater, and the original therapy session, all in one smoky circle. Anthropologists who've lived with hunter-gatherer groups, like the Hadza, the Ruhonzi, and the AKA, all describe the same transition. Daytime is for efficiency, hunting, gathering, cooking, surviving. Nighttime belongs to the imagination. Once the predators quiet and the chores fade, the camp becomes a breathing archive of memory. Around the fire, elders unspool myths that explain the sun, the moon, the rivers, and occasionally, why it's always the cousin's fault when the hunt fails. The firelight does strange things to faces. It softens them, erases hierarchy. Chiefs, healers, and children all look equally mysterious in that flicker. Authority dissolves into story. It's not hard to see why so many oral traditions insist the gods prefer night. It's the one time humans sound like them, inventing worlds with nothing but breath and flame. Every circle had its structure. Among the Plains tribes, stories were often told in rotation, each person adding or correcting details, ensuring no version ever belonged to just one voice. Among the San, narratives weren't just entertainment, they were behavioral blueprints. A tale about an impatient hunter might end with laughter, and an unspoken reminder to avoid doing the same tomorrow. The moral was never tacked on. It was embedded in the rhythm, like an infection you wanted to catch. These fireside hours did what no tool or weapon could. They welded the group together. You couldn't fake laughter when you were huddled that close. You couldn't hide your fear when the story turned dark. Even silence carried meaning, shared awe, shared dread, shared digestion. The fire didn't just cook food, it cooked emotion until it became edible. Language itself evolved in these circles. The Koland response, cadence of myths, the pauses timed with the crack of burning wood, the way people used gesture and tone to keep attention, all of that sculpted early human speech. There's a reason bedtime stories still work. They mimic the ancient grammar of survival, where safety meant sound, and sound meant someone was still awake. And in every culture, it's the same cast of characters. There's the trickster who can't follow rules, the wise grandmother who fixes cosmic mistakes, the child who accidentally saves the world by being curious. These weren't entertainment. They were continuity disguised as gossip. Each tale mapped the invisible web that kept the group from unraveling. Modern research backs it up. Firelight storytelling releases oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds lovers, mothers, and friends. A shared myth literally rewires the group's chemistry, synchronizing heartbeats and attention. Evolution seems to have bribed us into empathy through narrative. Not a bad trick. So when you imagine those circles, the faces half-lit, the smoke rising, the words looping, you're looking at the original social network, one that didn't need usernames or electricity, just the dark, the fire, and the mutual agreement to keep each other human until dawn. If you asked an archaeologist to describe what order looks like before civilization, they'd probably say, a circle of ashes and bones. It's not chaos, it's choreography. Every camp, even the temporary ones, followed a pattern so consistent it bordered on ritual. It wasn't random where people slept, where food was stored, or where tools were left to cool by the fire. Those patterns became memory, and that memory became culture. Among the Plains tribes, for example, the position of each tipi inside the great camp circle wasn't decided by chance. Families of certain clans or societies had fixed places, often inherited from ancestors. The chief's lodge faced the sunrise, a symbolic alignment with renewal, while the rest arranged around it, following a clockwise order reflecting the tribe's cosmology. You could tell a person's social rank, role, and even family alliances just by walking the perimeter. Geography and theology shared the same tent. The same principle appeared far from the plains. The Hadza, though more fluid in daily movement, still formed consistent patterns when they settled women and children near the central hearth. Men slightly outward, waste and animal remains further still. The Inuit organized snow huts around shared work areas, not for decoration, but because wind and smell taught them everything about positioning. Even when no one was consciously designing, the result looked designed, proof that survival had its own kind of architecture. Anthropologists call this spatial memory, the way the body remembers arrangement long after the mind stops thinking about it. Set up a camp once, and you're improvising. Do it every night for a lifetime, and you're performing choreography older than language. Children grew up internalizing this geometry. When it came time to build their own camps, they didn't need instructions. They could feel where everything should go, the way a bird feels magnetic north. These arrangements weren't just efficient, they were psychological comfort. The same layout repeated night after night told everyone the world was still intact. If the fire burned in its usual place, if the elders sat where they always sat, if the hunters tied their weapons at the same angle to the posts, then nothing catastrophic had happened yet. In a world without clocks or calendars, consistency was the only measure of peace. Even the direction of entry mattered. Plains camps opened to the east. Arctic tents were built with the wind behind them. The Himba and Maasai placed gates toward the stars used for navigation. Each camp was a compass, aligning the group's inner order with the outer world's rhythm. They didn't just sleep in the landscape, they slept with it, synchronized to the same invisible metronome that governed migration, season, and survival. And when people moved, the memory moved with them. You could rebuild a camp halfway across the continent and still know exactly where everyone belonged. Anthropologists studying mobile tribes noticed something haunting. When individuals were separated, they instinctively rebuilt fragments of that spatial logic. A small fire, a makeshift circle of stones, even an imagined boundary in the sand. It wasn't just habit, it was identity mapped onto space. That invisible architecture, orderly, circular, resilient, did something remarkable. It turned impermanence into tradition. It proved that even people who owned nothing could possess structure. And while later civilizations would call it city planning, it began right there, in a clearing, under starlight, drawn by memory, and held together by the simple faith that everything, even rest, has its proper place. For all the poetry about lions and spirits, the truth is that most danger came wearing a familiar face. Other humans were the real predators, louder, craftier, and, unfortunately, bilingual. When tribes arranged themselves in circles, it wasn't just to guard against teeth in the dark. It was to see who might come walking with a smile and a spear. The circular layout had military logic baked into its bones. Among the plains tribes, each encampment was a miniature fortress, tipis in a ring, horses tethered just beyond, with the chief's lodge facing east. As if daring dawn itself to misbehave, the arrangement wasn't decoration, it was defense. If a raid came, every warrior knew exactly where to run. Horses could be gathered instantly, arrows could fly in any direction, and the camp could collapse into organized chaos faster than most modern armies could find their boots. Archaeological traces of nomadic settlements in Eurasia show the same thing, rings of post holes and hearths with deliberate gaps for entrance and escape. In some African and Central Asian groups, livestock pens doubled as walls. The animals were both assets and alarms. The sound of a startled cow could wake a camp faster than any priest's blessing. People have always been the most imaginative kind of threat. Among the Comanche and Apache, raids were not random acts of violence but calculated maneuvers timed to weather, moonlight, and sleep cycles. Everyone knew it, which meant the layout of a camp was an argument written in earth. We are ready. We are not prey. Even the fire's location mattered. To Central, and you made a perfect target. To Dim, and you invited testing footsteps. The glow had to say, yes, we're awake, even when half the camp wasn't. The Lakota word, T-O-Pei, meant not just camp, but extended family, the people you'd die for, and also the people you had to keep alive. In battle, the same circle that kept children warm turned into formation. Horses galloped from the gaps that doubled as exits. Women and elders guarded supplies or gathered arrows from the ground. It was a choreography of necessity, as seamless as breathing, and the paranoia wasn't paranoia. History records the cost of being careless. Entire bands wiped out for leaving one side of the camp unguarded. Villages burned because a sentry fell asleep. Those stories became warnings, and those warnings became architectural features. The perfect camp wasn't comfortable, it was inconvenient by design. Every fire, every sleeping spot, every bundle of supplies existed in relation to defense. But human danger wasn't always external. Sometimes the threat came from inside, a feud, a betrayal, a cousin with too much ambition. The circle forced accountability. There were no shadows deep enough for secrets. Everyone faced everyone. Arguments happened in the open, voices overlapping like drumming, but no one could hide. The geometry itself discouraged deceit. You could storm off, sure, but only as far as the edge of the firelight. There's something grimly elegant about that. The same shape that protected people from outsiders also made them confront each other. Safety demanded exposure. To live in a circle was to live visibly. Your loyalties, your fear, even your posture were public record. The modern world calls that transparency. For early humans, it was just another night without getting ambushed. And as dawn broke, when the horizon went from black to bruised orange, the camp would expand again, scouts leaving, hunters readying, women dousing the fires. The circle would dissolve, only to be rebuilt somewhere else, identical in its logic, everything in its place, everyone watching everyone, and no one entirely trusting peace. Long before sonar or alarm systems, people learned that the night speaks if you know how to listen. In the darkness of open plains or frozen tundra, vision was almost useless, but sound carried meaning like a language older than speech. The circular camp turned this into science. Its shape didn't just organize bodies, it shaped acoustics. The Hadza, who still sleep in open rings, describe how certain sounds belong: the crackle of fire, the rhythm of breathing, the sigh of shifting earth. Anything outside that pattern feels wrong immediately. The circle acts like a drum skin. It catches every vibration and folds it inward. One misstep, one broken twig, and the entire formation stirs. What looks primitive is actually acoustic engineering done by people with nothing but ears, bones, and terror to guide them. Archaeologists studying ancient campsites noticed fire pits positioned precisely at sound's center, the way an amphitheater places its stage. A whisper spoken near the hearth can travel evenly across a circle of sleeping bodies. The design meant no one needed to shout. It also meant that danger didn't need to be seen. It could be heard, amplified, and acted upon before a predator even crossed the boundary. In the Arctic, the Inuit used silence as surveillance. Snow muffles everything, so even a breath can sound suspicious. Hunters who spent their lives reading wind and ice carried that vigilance into the camp. A dog's sudden growl, the groan of ice shifting under weight, each was a message. Some families even positioned tents so that the wind carried sound through them like an early warning echo chamber. Imagine a home designed to listen for ghosts. The San and Ruhonzi of southern Africa developed similar auditory habits. They could distinguish the distance and direction of animal footsteps in total darkness, an evolutionary inheritance that made survival possible. Modern experiments show that hunter-gatherers trained in this way process sound faster than urban listeners, detecting anomalies before conscious thought catches up. Their ears, in other words, never stopped working, even in sleep. In large plains camps, sound awareness became communal art. Horses snorted, dogs barked, humans murmured, every layer of noise feeding into a living sensor network. Some elders could tell, just by the rhythm of the night, whether a storm was coming or if raiders were approaching on horseback miles away. The ground itself spoke in low tremors, translated through bone and instinct. It was less listening and more constant negotiation with the unseen. Even fire played a role. Its crackle wasn't just pleasant ambience, it created a wall of irregular sound that masked human breathing and movement, confusing predators or attackers. The fire was both lighthouse and camouflage, the same way a city's hum now hides our own pulse. What people call peaceful silence today would have been panic back then. Real safety sounded like murmuring, shifting, living noise. And then there were the echoes, literal and social. A cough from one side of the camp drew a response from another, not out of concern but calibration. A kind of acoustic heartbeat that reassured everyone the system was still intact. Sleep became a symphony of shared vulnerability. Each sound confirmed existence. Each echo whispered, "We're still here." When dawn finally bled into the horizon, it didn't arrive with trumpets or birdsong. It arrived in sound, first wood snapping, water boiling, a single human cough that became a chorus. The night folded up, mission complete. Every noise had been accounted for, every silence survived. You'd think that once humans invented doors and locks, the circle would have become obsolete, a relic of prehistory, filed away with stone tools and common sense. But no, the instinct refused to die. Even with architecture, we kept rebuilding the same pattern, just with more walls and fewer reasons to admit why. The circle lingered like muscle memory in the blueprints of civilization. You can see it everywhere if you know what to look for. Powwows, reindeer herder, camps, Mongolian yurts, African kraals, all still shaped like the world's first survival plan. The tents of the Nenets curve inward toward a shared hearth. The yurts of Central Asia open to the south, forming circular villages that can fold and reassemble overnight. Even at a scout camp or music festival, people instinctively pitch their tents around the bonfire, as if expecting wolves to RSVP. Civilization, apparently, hasn't cured our paranoia, it's just gentrified it. Urban planners might call it efficient, spatial distribution. Anthropologists call it unbroken lineage. The circle works because it's honest about what people are. Nervous, social mammals who feel safer when they can see each other's faces. You can put humans in skyscrapers, arrange them in cubicles, or cram them into subway cars. They'll still end up forming small, defensive rings around coffee machines. The geometry of comfort doesn't negotiate. In modern powwows, across North America, the circular dance arena continues that ancient logic. Dancers move clockwise, mirroring the path of the sun, with spectators encircling them like a living horizon. It's not nostalgia, it's continuity. The same pattern that once guarded against predators now guards against forgetting. Every step retraces an architecture that predates the word home. Even the military still obeys it. Circular defensive formations appear in battlefields and survival manuals. Firefighters and rescue teams set up camp in rings for communication and safety. When things go wrong, humans instinctively turn inward. It's the oldest algorithm we have. Face the center, trust the structure, and keep the perimeter tight. The irony is that the circle endures, not because it's ancient, but because it's efficient. It minimizes conflict, maximizes visibility, and makes warmth democratic. Everyone gets the same distance to the fire, the same share of smoke in their eyes. Hierarchy softens in a circle. No one sits at the head of a flame. It's equality disguised as practicality. Even our digital lives mimic it. Video calls, a grid of faces glowing around a central silence. Online communities that form rings of shared obsession. The architecture of belonging, just relocated to the screen. The predators have changed, sure, but the instinct hasn't. Stay together, keep watch, make the dark smaller by surrounding it. And if you travel far enough into deserts, tundras, or even suburban parks, you'll find that wherever people stop long enough to build a fire, they still end up arranging themselves the same way. Circles of laughter, circles of planning, circles of exhaustion, geometry as inheritance. We like to think progress is linear, that we've moved on from sleeping in rings like anxious gazelles. But the truth is, we've only upgraded the materials. The instinct remains ancient, looping quietly beneath everything we build, reminding us that safety was never a wall, it was a shape. The circle, in the end, wasn't just a shape people slept in. It was an idea, one so durable that it outlived the predators that inspired it. To early humans, it meant survival. To their descendants, it meant order. Somewhere along the way, it began to mean everything. The sun, the moon, the seasons, the soul, time itself. You could erase the stories and the languages, but never the geometry. The ancients didn't draw lines between physics and faith. The same curve that kept the wind off the fire was also the curve that described the heavens. When the Lakota spoke of the sacred hoop, or when the Dogon built circular villages aligned with the stars, they weren't being poetic, they were describing the literal architecture of existence. The cosmos itself, they thought, was a sleeping circle. You simply lived inside its repetition. There's a reason nearly every cosmology spirals back to it. The Mayan calendar, the Hindu Kalachakra, the Celtic knot, the Buddhist mandala, all different vocabularies for the same wordless intuition that life doesn't move forward, it revolves. You come back to what you've left, changed but recognizable, like a camp rebuilt on the same ground after migration. The world turns, the fire burns, and somewhere in between, the human heart finds symmetry. The irony, of course, is that circles also trap. What once protected can easily confine. The same structure that kept the hyenas out also kept curiosity in. To break the circle meant danger, but it also meant discovery. Civilization only began when someone decided to step outside the firelight and trust that there might be something worth the risk. Every explorer, every heretic, every scientist since has been, in a way, a renegade of geometry. And yet, even they return. When danger comes, war, cold, disaster, loneliness, people instinctively rebuild the ring. Refugee camps, storm shelters, candlelit vigils, all circular, all defiant. The fire changes shape. Sometimes it's a phone screen, sometimes it's an actual flame, but the instinct is identical. Face inward, share warmth, keep watch. Pretend the night still listens. The philosophy of the circle isn't about perfection. It's about endurance. It's the recognition that safety doesn't come from building higher walls, but from keeping each other visible. It's the awareness that the oldest architecture of protection was also the first architecture of community. And, quietly, it's the understanding that the cosmos itself behaves the same way, collapsing, expanding, endlessly looping, always returning to itself. Even now, when someone lights a fire and people gather around it laughing, telling stories, staring into the orange glow, they're reenacting a pattern 1,000,000 years old. It's not nostalgia, it's inheritance. A whisper of the first night that didn't end in fear. The first realization that warmth could be shared, and that the dark could be negotiated, not conquered. In that sense, the circle never really disappeared. It just went indoors, traded stars for ceilings, and continued spinning quietly through every human gesture of belonging. The old tribes might be gone, the predators mostly replaced by deadlines, but the rule remains the same: survival, warmth, and meaning. All of it happens best when we face each other. It always began with a kind of quiet calculation, not the kind of math that fits on paper, but the sort that's done by the body. Before anyone thought to strike a spark, someone had already walked the ground, felt the way the wind leaned across the grass, and noticed where the smoke would rise clean instead of swirling back in their face. Fires, despite what modern camping guides might imply, were never plopped down in the middle of things. They were negotiated into place, between the logic of the earth and the paranoia of experience. Among the Inuit, for instance, a hearth carved into snow had to sit slightly below sleeping level, so the warm air stayed near the floor instead of escaping through the dome. In the Sahel, night fires were placed against termite mounds, which, aside from being excellent heat reflectors, also happened to keep out snakes. Plains people built theirs in the lee of buffalo hides or low ridges, always watching the wind so sparks wouldn't race into the grass. There was nothing accidental about any of it. Every flame existed where the air agreed to cooperate. And yet, there was something else, something a little superstitious, a little poetic, in how people read the ground. The San of southern Africa, for instance, avoided setting fires on termite burrows because they said the insects would curse the smoke, which, translated into less mystical language, meant the methane fumes could explode. Even so, the line between practical and spiritual wasn't clear. The ground had moods. A damp hollow meant coughing through the night. A ridge meant a restless wind. Sometimes it felt safer to light the fire in a spot that simply felt right, a kind of sensory memory inherited from those who'd already frozen, smoked, or suffocated in their sleep. If you map out ancient campsites, the circular depressions in Siberia, the ringed ash pits in the Kalahari, the charred outlines in early European caves, you'll find that the hearth never sits in the same place twice, but it always obeys the same invisible geometry. It's as if, no matter the continent, people could sense the quiet laws of air, stone, and body heat, even without naming them. Fire was not a thing you made. It was a temporary agreement between warmth and wind, a kind of treaty drawn in smoke. And as night fell, when the first crackle began and faces turned amber in the glow, the geometry of warmth turned into something else, a geometry of belonging. The spot wasn't just chosen for survival. It was chosen for proximity to bodies, to breath, to stories. Because when the air cooled and the animals began to move beyond the edge of light, everyone instinctively turned inward, toward that single, deliberate flame. That's where the circle began to form, not just of stones or hides, but of meaning. And that brings us to the next layer of the night, how fire, once placed, became the axis around which life itself revolved, the circles of survival. The circle came naturally, like breathing. No one needed to announce, "Let's sit this way." It happened the same way wolves curl around their young or birds nest in spirals. An instinct older than language, maybe even older than fear. Once the fire found its place, the bodies followed. The circle was both architecture and ritual, drawn in footprints rather than stone. At first glance it looked simple, everyone facing the warmth, backs turned to the dark. But every circle carried quiet mathematics. There was the width of the ring, far enough so the heat reached, close enough that shadows overlapped. There was the symmetry, the balance between sleeping space and escape routes. And there was the unspoken rule: never leave a gap wide enough for eyes to shine through. Predators, after all, prefer openings. Archaeologists have traced this pattern across continents, the same radius appearing in Paleolithic camps of Europe, in hunter-gatherer fire rings of Australia, in the Great Plains winter lodges. The radius corresponds roughly to the distance at which one can speak without raising their voice. The fire, then, wasn't only a heater. It was an acoustic instrument, the original amplifier. It made conversation possible when the cold tried to silence everything else. And inside that space, something changed. The fire's center wasn't just physical, it was psychological. When people sat around it, they didn't just share warmth, they shared rhythm. Breathing synced, blinks matched. And as the flames danced, faces became readable again. In the dark, humans are isolated creatures. In the circle, they became one organism pulsing with light. Among the Sami, reindeer herders built their night fires so that smoke drifted upward through the center of the tent's opening. leaving everyone else in clean air. Among the plains peoples, the circle around the hearth mirrored the sky. The stars above were ancestors, the flames below their echo. Among Arctic groups, each person's sleeping place was aligned to the fire in a specific order. Elders nearest the warmth, children and dogs forming the outer insulation of the living. Even distance became hierarchy. To outsiders, it might have looked like simple camp etiquette: who sits where, who feeds the flame, who tells the story. But to those who lived by it, the circle was the only known way to keep both warmth and sanity intact. The dark outside wasn't just cold. It was formless, full of things that didn't blink. Inside the ring, fire gave the night a shape. Still, not every circle was friendly. In some camps, it was a test. The ones who sat too close risked burns. Those too far, frostbite. Fire taught balance. Even a small shift in the ring could reveal arrogance, fear, or rebellion. The circle was social gravity. It pulled everyone toward a fragile center. And if you broke the symmetry, you broke the spell. But symmetry alone didn't keep the night at bay. Beyond warmth and geometry, there were other forces less visible, more atmospheric, that decided where the flame truly belonged. Because to light a fire was also to challenge the wind. And the wind, in most places, was never entirely human. Every night wind had a personality. Some were polite, brushing the fire gently like a passing thought. Others arrived like critics, dismantling the flame one gust at a time. And for those who lived by fire, wind wasn't just weather, it was temperament. You didn't fight it, you negotiated with it. Among the Navajo, people believed that certain winds carried the voices of ancestors, while others were malicious wanderers that could slip into your lungs if you breathed too deeply at dusk. The fire's position, therefore, wasn't only about smoke control, it was about diplomacy. A hearth turned slightly east invited blessings. One facing west risked drawing in shadows. The Arctic Chukchi lit theirs with the opening of the tent turned away from the death wind. The north, a tradition that doubled as excellent insulation. The fire itself became a translator between elements. In Amazonian camps, smoke was thought to carry human scent upward so that the spirits of the forest would recognize the living and leave them alone. In parts of Mongolia, smoke moving erratically was a warning, either a coming storm or a displeased ancestor. And so people watched it carefully, half meteorologists, half mystics. The direction of smoke could decide whether to sleep easy or stay awake until dawn. But superstition was just the poetic half of practical genius. Long before anyone had words for convection or oxygen flow, people already knew how to read the invisible. A spark's behavior told you whether the air was dry enough to catch fire, whether the night would frost over, or whether the breath of the camp was balanced. Too still, and the fire suffocated. Too wild, and it scattered embers into the grass. Fire needed wind, but the right kind of wind, in the right amount. That constant tension between feeding and fighting gave rise to a strange kind of respect. People didn't curse the wind. They named it, bribed it, whispered to it. When the Himba of Namibia built their hearths, they left one side open for the ancestral wind to pass through, as if the fire needed supervision from the other world. To outsiders, it looked like misplaced engineering. To them, it was balance, an architecture of belief wrapped in the laws of physics. The night, however, had a way of turning these relationships inside out. There were times when the smoke refused to rise straight, when it twisted as if arguing with itself. And when that happened, the camp went silent. No one stirred the fire. No one spoke. It was as if the air itself had opinions, as if unseen witnesses were deciding whether humans deserved their heat tonight. That kind of attention, the way people stared into the movement of air and ash, eventually became more than superstition. It turned into language, a way to read messages, not from gods or weather, but from the fire itself. Because once you start watching smoke long enough, you realize it doesn't just rise, it communicates. And that's where the night begins to talk back through wisps, directions, and signals, which leads us into the next mystery. Smoke as communication. Smoke was never just residue. It was a message system written in air. It spoke in curls, in hesitations, in the way it leaned or dispersed. To modern eyes, it's nothing more than chemistry particles suspended in motion. But to anyone who lived by its moods, smoke was closer to language, and every puff had its grammar. In the Amazon, hunters studied how smoke drifted through the canopy to predict whether spirits or animals were watching. A column that rose straight meant safety. One that flattened meant an audience. The Dogon in Mali read the smoke's shape during rituals. Thin spirals were blessings. Thick clouds were warnings. Plains people used it literally, to signals by day. Coded smokes across miles of horizon. One of the first long-distance networks of the human race. It wasn't accidental art. It was calibrated communication. The color, thickness, and rhythm all mattered. The original Morse code of the earth. But even within the camp, smoke had a subtler function. It kept order. Its direction determined where people sat, who could cook, who needed to move. An elder coughing through the haze was reason enough to shift the whole arrangement. It trained people in attentiveness. You learned to read the air before you spoke into it. The fire punished arrogance. If you ignored the signs, it filled your lungs with lessons. There's also the quiet irony that the very thing meant to sustain life, warmth, food, protection, was constantly threatening to choke everyone alive. The first homes, huts, and tipis were all smoky lungs. People slept half-blinded, half-marinated in their own survival. And yet, over generations, they learned to use that inconvenience as guidance. The smoke's movement told them which direction the wind would come from at dawn, how the weather would shift, even how stable the atmosphere was above their heads. Fire became a primitive barometer, and smoke the prophet. But the most human part of all this is how we ritualized it. In many places, people sent smoke upward, not for information, but for approval. A slow-burning log meant patience. Sudden sparks meant laughter. A collapse of flame into ash meant exhaustion. The day itself exhaling, and the smoke that rose from it all was carried off like a report, sent back to whoever, or whatever, was supposed to be keeping score. Still, not every fire was public. Some burned in secrecy, behind screens of rock or hide, where smoke was carefully hidden from rivals or jealous gods. Because in many cultures, the wrong kind of smoke, too bright, too early, too much, was an invitation for trouble. To be seen burning could mean being hunted, and that's when the human story around fire splits. There were fires that cooked, fires that warned, and fires that governed. But then there were fires that belonged to someone, marked by gender, by taboo, by ownership. The line between flame and authority blurred, and soon even the act of lighting it carried social meaning. Which brings us, inevitably, to the next quiet law of the night: fire and gendered space. If you watched carefully at dusk, you'd notice that not everyone approached the fire the same way. There was a choreography to it: who squatted, who stood, who fed it, who only watched. The hearth wasn't neutral. It divided the world. It glowed differently for men and women, for hunters and cooks, for the living and the almost sacred. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, the women's fire, smaller, steadier, stayed within the circle of the huts, used for cooking, warmth, and gossip. The men's fires, built further out, faced the wilderness. Their light meant to guide late hunters or ward off predators. Each flame cast a boundary, one domestic, one defensive. And when the two met, during shared meals or story nights, there was always a moment of negotiation. Whose fire would dominate the night's rhythm? In the Arctic, the gender of the flame was even literal. Among Inuit families, women owned the kulik, an oil lamp carved from soapstone, shaped like a crescent moon. It provided all the heat, all the light, and all the cooked food. Men might hunt for seal oil to fuel it, but the lamp itself belonged to the women, the keepers of warmth. To extinguish a woman's lamp without permission wasn't just rude, it was an insult to life itself. In winter, that could be a death sentence. Similar patterns appeared across continents. Among certain Bantu groups, the husband's ceremonial fire and the wife's kitchen fire were both sacred, but strictly separate. One couldn't be lit from the other. Each had its own lineage. In some Pacific societies, fires for childbirth and fires for war were kept apart, as if their energies might contaminate one another. The taboo wasn't random, it was an acknowledgement that fire, like people, carried identity. These divisions also extended into architecture. In some early villages, archaeologists have found dual hearths, one central, one secluded, their placement mirroring the social map of gender. The hearth was a diagram of power, drawn in ash, and the rules were clear: cross into the wrong fires, space, and risk spiritual or social punishment. Yet, curiously, it was always the women's fire that endured longer. When a family migrated, they carried embers from the domestic hearth in clay pots or bundles of bark, not from the men's fire, but from the one that kept the children alive. That small ember was considered the heart of continuity, the spark of the household's soul. So even when men went off to wage war or hunt, what they called their fire, the visible one, the loud one, eventually died, and the quiet, consistent one inside the camp survived. Civilization, it turns out, was built not on the roar of the hunt, but on the whisper of a steady flame tended by hands too busy to boast. But outside those circles of domestic warmth, another purpose of fire waited colder, more strategic, and older than civilization itself. Beyond the edge of safety, the night had eyes, and the flame had to be placed, not for cooking or comfort, but for survival. And that's where the boundary of light became a wall of defense. The next story in this nocturnal architecture, the predator perimeter. The line between a campfire and a fortress was thinner than it looked. Out there, where the dark had claws and teeth, humans learned early that light could be weaponized. The same flame that roasted roots and dried skins also tricked the night into believing we were more numerous than we really were. The first hunters who placed small fires in rings around their camp weren't just being cautious. They were performing theater. Each flicker suggested movement, presence, vigilance. Lions hesitated at the shimmer of multiple shadows. Hyenas saw the trembling silhouettes of 10 people where there were only 2. Fire distorted reality, granting humans the illusion of armies. It was psychological warfare with embers. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, this trick repeated itself. Small, low fires burning intermittently at the outer edge of sleep. The sand scattered them across the savannah like false eyes. Mongolian herders positioned them around horse enclosures so wolves thought the herd was guarded from every direction. And in the Australian desert, the Pintupi made ghost fires, tiny flames meant not to warm, but to signal occupancy. Even the most ruthless predators preferred not to gamble on a campsite that looked alive. But the tactic had another function. It taught people to read the night as geometry. A fire too close blinded the watchman, too far, and its light faded before the eyes adjusted. The perimeter had to be precise, forming a perfect ring of half-light, enough to sense danger, not enough to be seen by it. The circle of safety was also a circle of humility. Stray beyond it, and you were no longer human, just another creature in the dark. Among Arctic hunters, dogs patrolled the invisible border where the fire's heat met the frost. When a dog barked, the flame's perimeter became a map of sound, human warmth pushed back by echo. The fire wasn't just defending. It was defining. It said, here begins order. Beyond this chaos, and yet, some people believed that predators respected the fire, not just out of fear, but out of understanding. In folklore from Siberia to Patagonia, the fire was said to contain the essence of the sun, the same power that ruled the day. To step into its light was to step into divine territory. Animals avoided it the way humans avoided shrines. The night belonged to them, but the light was borrowed from something higher. Still, not all threats had fur or claws. There were nights when danger didn't creep, it waited, and fire became not just a barrier, but a clock, marking shifts, counting hours, measuring how long the darkness would last. Because as soon as you start watching flames for too long, you realize they're telling time. And that brings us to the next strange rhythm of the night, the fire as a clock. There was a moment somewhere between the last chatter of crickets and the first tremor of dawn, when the fire became the only thing left moving. Its rhythm replaced the sun's. Long before people marked hours with gears or bells, they measured them by how the logs sighed, by how far the glow reached across the ground. Time wasn't counted, it was burned. Every flame told a story of duration. A large central fire, built for warmth and storytelling, was meant to last until the deep of night, the social hour, the time of laughter, arguments, and slow cooking. When it collapsed into embers, smaller fires took over. The herders watched flame, the sentry's stick fire, the mother's lamp beside sleeping children. The camp transformed gradually into constellations, each ember a star, each star a duty. In some desert tribes, a man's reliability was judged by how well he could keep his watchfire alive until dawn. Among Arctic peoples, night sentinels timed their patrols to the crackle pattern of whale oil lamps. In the forests of North America, travelers used the burn length of pine knots to track how far the night had gone, each knot an hour, give or take. Fire was the only accurate timekeeper that could be trusted when the sky vanished. It also trained the body to understand duration differently. Those who tended the fire learned patience, not the idle kind, but the kind that watches transformation happen in slow motion. A log turning to ash wasn't decay, it was a metronome. The mind quieted, the pulse matched the flicker, and time lost its panic. For a few hours each night, existence was simple. Feed the fire, watch it dim, wait for the next breath of light. And, as with everything humans touched, the practice became ceremonial. The passing of time was marked, not by numbers, but by gestures, adding a log, stoking the coals, blowing on embers. Some Amazonian tribes describe dawn as the moment the last ember lies down. In other places, like the Sami tundra, families left the dying fire untouched so the spirits could finish their night's work. The fire, in its fading, became a schedule, not only for the living but for whatever else shared the darkness. Eventually, this sense of rhythm expanded beyond practical use. In temples, fires were arranged in specific directions, each flame representing a celestial body, a cosmic clock ticking through ritual. The positioning of each hearth mirrored the order of the stars, as if humans, sitting on the ground, were quietly syncing their nights with the universe. It's no wonder that so many early mythologies claimed time itself was born from fire, that the sun was once a campfire the gods forgot to put out. Because to those who lived by its glow, flame wasn't just warmth, it was continuity, a heartbeat stretched across centuries. And from this rhythm of hours and stars came another impulse, to arrange fire not only in time, but in sacred space, to make its placement deliberate, aligned with the unseen architecture of the world. The night, after all, wasn't random, neither were its fires. And that's where we step into the deeper blueprint of belief, the sacred geometry of flames. If the ordinary fire was a clock, the sacred one was a compass. No priest or elder would ever place it just anywhere. A true fire had coordinates, invisible, precise, divine. It had to face something, align with something, correspond to something that wasn't immediately there. The spot mattered because it was a reflection of the sky. In India's Vedic rituals, the altar fires were laid out according to the cosmos: east for rebirth, west for ancestors, south for sacrifice, north for immortality. Every ember had a destination. A misplaced log wasn't a small mistake. It was a cosmic misalignment. The priests carried sticks carved with astronomical symbols, measuring distances with their feet, constructing miniature universes that breathed. When they lit the flame, they weren't making heat, they were reigniting order. Far away, the Navajo arranged fires so that their smoke drifted toward the east, toward the dawn, toward beginnings. The hearths opening in the Hogan faced sunrise because the first rays of light were thought to cleanse the spirit. The fire's ashes, swept each morning, traced the movement of the sun across the seasons. In the Arctic, the Sami placed their hearth at the center of the lavu, with a smoke hole perfectly above it, not out of architectural vanity, but because the hole mirrored the North Star. Their ceiling was the cosmos, and their fire, its echo. Even in ancient European sites, megalithic circles, Bronze Age settlements, hearths often align with solar paths, the summer solstice marking one axis, the winter another. Those fires weren't accidents of convenience. They were declarations that humans had learned to inscribe warmth onto the cold geometry of time. But geometry, in these settings, was never sterile. It was devotional. When the Maasai lit fires facing Mount Kilimanjaro, or when Siberian shamans burned offerings aligned with the pole star, the act wasn't aesthetic, it was metaphysical choreography. Fire was a line drawn between worlds. The flames rose vertically, but their meaning radiated outward, binding sky, earth, and body in one incandescent formula. And though modern eyes see only symmetry, those who lived within it saw a conversation. Each hearth was an axis mundi, a place where heaven leaned down to touch dirt. To tend such a fire was to maintain the universe's pulse. It's no coincidence that many ancient languages used the same word for hearth and world. The fire wasn't in the world was around the fire. Still, even the sacred had a hierarchy. Not every hand could approach the central flame. Not every person could sit near it. The geometry of heat mirrored the geometry of power, the next unspoken law written in ashes and proximity. Which brings us quietly closer to the human order encoded in the hearth. Hierarchies of heat. Every circle had its politics. The fire, though shared, was never democratic. Its warmth radiated like privilege, strongest at the center, weaker toward the edges. Where you sat wasn't a matter of comfort. It was a statement of who you were. Archaeologists can read this even from ash patterns. In Paleolithic caves, the densest char marks cluster near the leader's or elder's place, the warmest spot, closest to both food and visibility. Younger members sat farther back, half in shadow. The seating plan was as rigid as a court diagram. Firelight organized hierarchy long before thrones or crowns existed. Among the Inuit, elders and hunters occupied the inner circle near the kullik lamps, while children and dogs slept at the periphery, forming, quite literally, a wall of warmth. In nomadic herder camps of Central Asia, the patriarch sat opposite the entrance, where the draft couldn't touch him. Visitors were placed strategically, close enough to honor, far enough not to offend. Heat allocation was etiquette. Even in early settlements, the main hearth of a household marked its lineage. When a son founded a new home, he carried embers from his father's fire, not symbolically, but physically, to establish continuity. Yet, that borrowed flame didn't grant equality. The older hearth remained senior, a literal source of authority. To share fire was to share ancestry. To sit nearest it was to inherit memory. Gender played its part too. In some African villages, women controlled the cooking fires, but couldn't sit by the communal one during council gatherings. The inverse existed elsewhere. Women's proximity symbolized peace, their absence, tension. Either way, the fire's heat revealed social temperature. When quarrels broke out, people shifted position, inching closer or away. Diplomacy measured in degrees of warmth. Anthropologists have often noted that in harsh climates, fire dictated not just survival but structure. The distance between you and the flame defined the distance between you and power. The camp was a radiant model of the cosmos, the hottest point in the middle, fading out into chill and darkness. Civilization, in its earliest drafts, was thermal, but warmth, as every human eventually learned, was temporary. Even hierarchies cooled. Every night ended the same way. The coals dimmed, the voices softened, and the order dissolved into smoke. And when that happened, something almost ceremonial followed. The deliberate act of letting the world's center die. Because in the end, the real meaning of fire wasn't how it burned, but how it went out. And that takes us to the final ritual of the night, extinguishing the night. There was a right way to end a fire. Letting it die on its own was considered lazy, or worse, disrespectful. Every culture had a small ceremony for the moment when the last flame folded into itself. In that silence, the night exhaled, and humans had to remember their place within it. Among the Inuit, the kullik lamp wasn't simply blown out. The wick was gently pressed into the oil, a quiet suffocation meant to preserve its spirit for the next lighting. In Japan, farmers covered their hearths with ashes in spirals, believing the smoke would guide ancestral souls back through the roof. In some Bantu communities, the dying fire was fed a final pinch of food, a gesture of thanks, as though the flame had eaten alongside everyone else. And when a camp moved, ashes were never left behind carelessly. In North American tribes, embers were buried in small pits to return the warmth to the ground. In Siberia, families scattered the ashes in patterns, a circle, a cross, sometimes a spiral, symbols that mapped cosmology onto soot. What might look like tidying up was, in truth, theology expressed through dust. The point wasn't erasure, it was closure. The fire that had defined the night, its warmth, its stories, its boundaries couldn't simply vanish. It had to be escorted back into the dark. People whispered farewells to it, just as they had once greeted its birth. The dying ember was treated like a small sun descending beneath the horizon, destined to rise again only if honored properly. But beneath all the superstition, there was something profoundly practical. Leaving embers unattended meant drawing predators, igniting dry grass, or suffocating in your sleep. Ritual was safety wearing poetry as camouflage. The dance of starting and ending of commanding light, then surrendering it, was humanity's first daily discipline. Even now, the gesture survives. We still blow out candles before sleep, still glance at stoves before leaving the house, still watch the red fade to black, as if it's a performance we've seen for 100,000 years. The logic of the ancient hearth lingers in the modern socket, the nightlight, the screen glowing rectangles, pretending to be fires we once truly needed. The truth is, our ancestors didn't fear the dark because it was empty. They feared it because it remembered. Each night, the extinguished fire marked a pact, renewed, warmth borrowed, then returned. and as the final coal collapsed, the night reclaimed what was always its own. The earth cooled, the air reset, and silence spread like water. In that hush, the geometry of warmth dissolved, circles faded, hierarchies leveled, stories ended mid-sentence, until someone, somewhere, struck another spark, and the treaty between light and life began again. It always began with the fire, before the wheel, before writing, before anyone thought to build something that wouldn't rot by morning. There was that single shimmering line between night and not night. Anthropologists like to call it the center of the camp, but that's a little too tidy. It was more like a living organ, breathing, shifting, occasionally sulking when the wood was damp. You could tell the state of a community by how its fire behaved. A lively crackle meant harmony. A low hiss and smoke in the eyes meant someone wasn't speaking the truth. Fire was never just heat, it was strategy. Light enough to blind the predators, warmth enough to keep the blood moving, smoke enough to drive away the insects that carried fevers. Some groups placed their fires deliberately off-center, using the shadows as a trap. The glow would lure in the curious, a hyena, a man, and the darkness just beyond it would hide the waiting spears. Even comfort was an act of calculation. And then there was the choreography around it. Every night, as if rehearsing a silent ritual, bodies would settle in predictable order. Infants closer to the flame, older children at their mothers' backs, adults facing outward. Not superstition, geometry. In a world without walls, you became one. The circle wasn't decoration, it was policy. Fire in the middle, everything worth saving orbiting around it. Anthropologists have traced this pattern from Arctic reindeer herders to desert nomads, as if humanity carried the same architectural instinct in its bones. Build warmth, then protect it. Ash became sacred too. A cooled hearth wasn't simply a pile of dirt, it was a ledger of what had lived there. In some societies, families returning to an old campsite would stir the ashes with reverence, as if waking the ghosts of past nights. Others would scatter them to the wind to erase their tracks, fearful that spirits or enemies might follow. Even the act of extinguishing had a ritual rhythm, never by breath, only by sand or water, because blowing directly on the fire was seen as breathing your life into it, and fire, fickle thing, might not give it back. Over time, the fire began to decide other things too. Who cooked, who spoke, who slept closest to whom. Hierarchy had a scent of fat sizzling, of wood, resin, of whoever had permission to feed the flames. The elders claimed it wasn't theirs, but the ancestors' domain. They were merely its caretakers. Yet somehow, they always sat where the light touched their faces just right, while everyone else looked at their backs in flickering half-shadow. Even so, the flame's light was democracy in its rawest form. No one could hide from it. Every face glowed equally grotesque, every secret warped by the same amber shimmer. People argued, laughed, plotted, courted, all under the judgment of that crackling eye. When the night stretched too long and the stories ran dry, someone would poke the embers and the whole group would breathe again. It was the oldest kind of resuscitation, not of lungs, but of belonging. And when the first sparks began to fade, that's when the second layer stirred. The low growl in the dark, the soft shuffle of paws along the perimeter, the dogs, keeping vigil where the light gave up. They were the insomnia of the camp. Long before alarm clocks or motion sensors, it was dogs who learned the language of the night, the way sound bends differently after moonrise, how danger breathes heavier than sleep. You could hear them before you saw them, a half-suppressed whine, a huff through the nose, the quiet rearranging of bones against the cold. Their rest was never full. Even their dreams seemed to have ears. No one remembers the first trade between human and dog, but the deal was brutally simple. We offered scraps and warmth. They offered vigilance. Some archaeologists argue that dogs began guarding people before people began guarding anything worth stealing. The evidence lies buried in old campsites, paw prints next to human footprints, both facing outward. The pattern repeats across continents, like a memory encoded in dirt. They weren't pets, not yet. They were partners in anxiety. A good dog didn't just bark, it interpreted. It knew the difference between the wind's mischief and a predator's intent. In Arctic camps, the dog's silence could be more alarming than their noise. Hunters learned to read the stillness, when the fur along a spine stiffened, when every head turned the same way. In that pause before sound, you could feel the entire perimeter tighten. Their senses worked like an early warning system made of flesh and devotion. At night, when fire blinded human eyes, dogs mapped the dark by smell alone. They knew the odor of kin, the stale musk of fear, the metallic tang of a stranger's sweat. Some tribes believed their nostrils caught not just scent but spirit, that they could smell deceit, or sickness, or the arrival of death days before it showed its face. When a dog howled without cause, people listened. Sometimes they prayed, sometimes they sharpened blades. Feeding them came with its own etiquette. Dogs ate after warriors but before children, a hierarchy that made outsiders wince but made perfect sense to those living at the edge of survival. You could birth another child. You couldn't easily replace a creature that could sense an ambush in its sleep. And so the circle expanded, fire at the heart, dogs on the rim, the two halves of a heartbeat that never quite synchronized. In some myths, dogs were the messengers between worlds, one paw in the living, one in the realm of the dead. Their eyes, reflecting firelight, looked almost supernatural, as if the ancestors had chosen them to keep watch long after people forgot how. Even when domestication softened their teeth, that old contract persisted. Modern cities still trust them at doors, gates, borders, remnants of the same ancient logic. Before you guard wealth, you must first guard sleep. And somewhere beyond the reach of their circles, where the dark grew thicker and silence more absolute, another ring of protection waited, bodies armed not with bark or flame, but with the discipline to become invisible. They were the outermost pulse of the night, the thin, breathing line between safety and whatever kept pacing just beyond it. Warriors didn't simply guard the camp, they embodied its insomnia. While others slept in layers of warmth and trust, they lingered at the edge where the world stopped making promises. Some leaned on spears, others crouched like shadows with eyes fixed on the horizon, learning to read wind as if it were a script. Every gust carried information, a shift in scent, a faint crack of bone under paw, the rhythm of branches against air. To call them soldiers would be a modern insult. These weren't men waiting for orders, they were the orders. Their task was a kind of devotion, not to conquer, but to ensure that life inside the circle remained uninterrupted. In many nomadic groups, the youngest warriors were forbidden from turning their backs on the fire. They faced outward, always outward, their silhouettes burning black against the light. They didn't look back, because the living depended on that refusal. Across the steppe, the tundra, the savanna, the composition changed, but the melody didn't. Spears became bows, bows became rifles, but the principle survived. Those who guarded slept least and aged fastest. Their hearing sharpened into something feral. They could tell friend from stranger by the sound of breathing. Anthropologists studying these patrol systems note how even the spacing of guards followed logic, each one close enough to sense the next man's presence, far enough that an arrow aimed at one wouldn't reach another. Protection was a geometry drawn in muscle and nerve. But the role wasn't only physical. Warriors also held the moral perimeter. Their rituals of initiation, scarring, fasting, isolation were rehearsals for silence. Fear was treated like an infection that needed burning out. Among some plains tribes, the night sentry would sit perfectly still for hours, listening to his own heartbeat until he could separate it from the pulse of the ground. In Arctic communities, guards paced in rhythm with the dogs, blending footsteps so predators couldn't tell where human ended and animal began. It was choreography disguised as defense. Fire gave them warmth but also exposure. Standing near it meant being seen by predators, by enemies, by the gods who might be counting courage. So they learned to move in half-light, letting the flames flicker on their weapons but not their faces. The camp depended on that anonymity. Fear couldn't recognize you if you refused to have a name in the dark. They were allowed few luxuries, sometimes a drink of broth passed in silence, sometimes a story told at dawn when vigilance briefly relaxed. The elders said that warriors carried not just spears but the dreams of the sleeping. If they faltered, the entire architecture of trust cracked. Civilization, in its first drafts, was built on that insomnia of the belief that someone was awake when you weren't. And beyond them, in the final ring of the night, sat those who no longer needed weapons. The ones whose watch was memory itself. They didn't guard with weapons, they guarded with time. While fire hissed and warriors stood in the wind, the elders sat just beyond the noise, where embers dimmed into the color of memory. Their vigilance was quieter, slower, but no less absolute. In many camps, You could find them awake long after everyone else, tending not the flames but the stories that kept the circle from forgetting why it existed. They were the custodians of pattern. Every custom, every taboo, every absurdly specific rule about which direction to sleep or when to feed the dogs had once been tested by hunger or blood. The elders remembered those tests. Their stories weren't entertainment. They were field manuals disguised as myth. A child might laugh at the tale of a man who mocked the spirits and was eaten by shadows, but an adult would know it meant something practical. Don't wander past the dogs after dark. What sounded superstitious was usually logistics in poetic form. Even their silences carried structure. The pauses between words were where the instructions hid. Among Arctic and desert peoples alike, elders would begin speaking only after long stretches of quiet, not because they were gathering thoughts, but because the quiet itself was the first lesson. Listen before you move. Measure before you act. Anthropologists often describe this as oral transmission, but it's more accurate to call it calibration. Each story adjusted the group's sense of risk, its internal compass of what the night could take from them. Elders decided where the fire should sit, where the tents should face, and when the warriors should rest. That authority didn't come from age alone, it came from accumulation. They were living archives, their minds crammed with coordinates, plant lore, treaties, betrayals. Some could recall migrations from decades before, as if they'd happened yesterday, reciting the position of stars used for navigation. Others carried genealogies that stretched back 10 generations, mapping who owed whom, who had broken peace, who might one day need forgiving. Memory itself was infrastructure, and yet the role was heavier than it looked. Knowledge had to be constantly repaired. When an elder died without passing on their stories, it was treated like losing a fortress wall. Some groups held mourning rites that resembled rebuilding. Young listeners would gather, retell fragments, argue about forgotten lines, and through that friction, restore the pattern. A civilization could survive hunger, frost, or war but not amnesia. Around them, the younger ones sometimes rolled their eyes at old warnings. The same way we do when history lectures us about mistakes, we'll obviously repeat. But when the wind changed, or the dogs started pacing, it was always the elders who knew what the sound meant. They had heard it before in another century, under another moon, but exactly the same. And from those remembered warnings came something even older than speech. The way people built their homes, their sleeping circles, their invisible boundaries. The design of safety itself, carried like instinct across generations. Every camp was a diagram of thought. From above, it looked simple. A few rings of tents, fires, and shadows. But to those who built them, it was an argument made of earth and instinct. Order against chaos, warmth against the unknown. You could almost read a community's philosophy by tracing its footprints. Where did they place the fire? How far apart were the sleeping mats? What direction faced the wind? Every answer revealed a quiet theory about survival. Anthropologists have noticed how these circular layouts appear almost everywhere. The tundra camps of the Netnits, the desert encampments of Tuareg, the grassland fires of ancient Europe. No shared language, no contact, yet the geometry repeats. A circle meant continuity. It let sound, heat, and scent travel evenly, so no one froze, no one could sneak in unnoticed. It wasn't aesthetic symmetry, it was physics applied to fear. The arrangement made every person a node in a living alarm system. Inside that architecture, hierarchy was spatial. Elders near the center, families arranged like petals, dogs and warriors at the edge. Each position wasn't assigned by rank alone, but by function. The way heat radiated, the way danger approached. To modern eyes, it might look like primitive planning. In truth, it was engineering disguised as ritual. People didn't call it design, they called it common sense, which is just another word for knowledge, so old it's forgotten its author. Every ring had permeability. You could hear the outer guard breathe, smell the stew from the center, see the shadows flicker against hide walls. Communication flowed like air. If a dog barked on one side, the sound traveled cleanly around the circumference, alerting everyone before the intruder reached the firelight. Compare that to modern architecture, walls thick with insulation, doors locked from inside, neighbors who never learn your name. Somewhere along the way, defense became isolation. The old circles, for all their fear, were warmer than our security systems. Even refuse had its place. Beyond the final ring, where the smell of humans faded, lay the dump bones, ashes, broken tools. Archaeologists love those piles. They are the archives of daily logic. You can see where someone spilled stew, where a child dropped a toy carved from antler, where someone sharpened a knife against boredom. Every discarded fragment outlines the same principle. The closer to the center, the more sacred. The farther out, the more disposable. In storm season, when winds turned vicious, people adjusted the pattern. Fires were dug into pits, shelters lowered, openings angled eastward to dodge the worst gusts. These weren't accidents of habit. They were encoded responses to millennia of trial and error. The world taught its lessons brutally, but it rewarded those who listened. And yet, not all borders were built of hide and bone. Some were invisible, humming in the air between the tents, rules, taboos, and songs meant to keep unseen dangers from crossing the line. A wall of belief, thinner than smoke, but just as hard to breach. Every circle had a ghost fence. You just couldn't see it. Long before the word religion was invented, people were already drawing borders in the air. Gestures, songs, forbidden steps. These invisible walls were as real as the dog's teeth. They divided what could be touched from what couldn't, what could be eaten, said, or even dreamed. To live safely meant remembering where the world stopped listening and where something else began. The rules differed from place to place, but the logic was consistent. The spirit world respected boundaries as much as predators did. Some desert groups tied bits of bone and hair at the camp's edge, not for decoration, but to remind the dead to keep to their own lanes. Arctic families muttered the names of the wind before sleeping, a kind of negotiation. You stay out there, we stay warm in here. The boundary wasn't made of faith but of etiquette. Taboos were the social architecture of fear. You didn't whistle after dark, because sound could call attention. You didn't point at stars, because the ancestors might think you were inviting them closer. Even laughter had rules. In many nomadic communities, laughing too loudly near the fire was believed to crack the camp's protection, as if joy itself could offend the listening dark. It wasn't Puritanism, it was acoustics of survival. The night echoed, and echoes could betray position. Anthropologists, with their notebooks and field lamps, often call these practices superstitions, but that misses the point. They weren't about belief, they were about calibration. Every word, every silence, was a tool for staying balanced in a world full of unpredictable forces. The gods were just the vocabulary for physics before the vocabulary existed. Some of these invisible fences protected not from spirits, but from ourselves. Ritual cleansing after birth or death kept grief from spilling into the living's work. Periods of silence after hunting prevented arrogance from inviting misfortune. Even sex and food followed cosmic scheduling, not moral law, but ecological rhythm. People learned the hard way that hunger or sickness could arrive right after indulgence, and so they wrapped restraint in sacredness. The spiritual perimeter wasn't static. It shifted with the wind, the moon, the season. When storms came or war was near, chants grew longer, offerings heavier. At times of peace, the air relaxed. The unseen guards could rest. You could feel it in how people spoke. Fewer whispers, more laughter, less watching of shadows. The camp breathed differently when it trusted the invisible wall to hold. And when the songs faded and people finally lay down, the world filled with another kind of vigilance, the quiet map of sound that told everyone they were still alive. Silence was never empty. In the old camps, it was a landscape, one you learned to read with your skin. Long before humans mapped the world with ink, they mapped it with sound. The crackle of a fire, the shuffle of a dog, the rustle of hide in the wind. Each was a coordinate, a pulse confirming that everything was still in its right place. If a single note went missing, someone noticed. Silence out of rhythm was as alarming as a scream. Night had its own grammar. The elders called it listening work. Babies cried differently depending on wind direction. Dogs barked in dialects of urgency. A warrior's cough at the perimeter carried through the tents like a coded message. I'm awake, all's well, or not. In a world where visibility ended 2 meters from the fire, you survived by knowing the texture of every noise. The ear replaced the eye as the dominant organ of safety. Anthropologists who have slept in such camps describe how the entire community breathes in sync. Inhalations and exhalations merging with the hiss of embers. Even sleep was collective. If one body stirred, the rhythm broke, and others followed. That's why mothers woke seconds before their babies cried, and why hunters rose before the first hint of dawn. The sound map was an organism, constantly self-directing. Every sound had meaning and place. Wood popping in the fire, normal. A branch snapping beyond the dogs, not a distant owl, maybe. But the trick lay in pattern recognition, what anthropologist Stephen Feld called acoustomology, knowledge through hearing. To live in such a circle was to be permanently attuned. Your nerves stretched across the night like invisible tripwires. Even the most mundane noises carried etiquette. A pot clanged too loudly, and you'd see 3 heads turn. Children learned early to walk with soft soles, to breathe through their noses, to whisper with their whole face. It wasn't repression, it was choreography. When you can't control nature, you control your own volume. And there was poetry in it. The idea that survival was an orchestra performed every night by beings half asleep. When someone died, their absence was heard before it was felt. A gap in the nighttime chorus, one less breath in the rhythm. The living adjusted unconsciously, closing ranks in sound, as if patching a hole in an invisible wall. In this way, grief wasn't silence. It was rebalancing, but the sound map had one flaw. It depended on everything functioning perfectly. When fire dimmed, or dogs grew restless, or warriors' vigilance faltered, the entire composition began to unravel. The night didn't roar, it whispered wrong. Every system, no matter how sacred, has a breaking point. The layered protections, fire dogs, warriors, elders, were built not on permanence but on vigilance, and vigilance is a muscle that trembles when tired. All it took was one missed signal, one ember left to die, one watchman nodding off, and the symmetry that had held the night at bay began to dissolve. Fire was usually the first to betray them. A sudden gust, a damp log, or a distracted hand could choke it to smoke. Without that pulse of light, everything turned unfamiliar, faces ground, even the sound of breathing. Some groups spoke of the fire's blindness, that moment when the camp forgot itself. Panic wasn't just fear of predators, it was the collapse of orientation. Without fire, the circle didn't exist. If the dogs went next, the unraveling quickened. Illness, hunger, or a bad hunt could thin their ranks. The silence of dogs was an omen that traveled faster than any rumor. People would whisper that the ancestors had withdrawn their sentinels, that the spirits had turned their ears elsewhere. Practically speaking, it meant the night grew deaf. The human ear simply couldn't stretch that far. Many villages kept dog skulls near the sleeping areas, not as trophies, but as substitutes for listening, bone relics of attention. Warriors failed more subtly, not through cowardice, but through exhaustion. Standing guard night after night meant living in a state of permanent anticipation. Eventually, every sense dulls, every shadow begins to look familiar. That's when the arrow comes from an enemy, or fate, or carelessness. When one guard fell, fear rippled inward. Even the fire seemed to dim out of respect or imitation. And then came the worst failure, forgetfulness. The elders, who carried the map of rules and warnings, could lose their precision with time. A ritual skipped, a boundary forgotten, a song sung out of season, the invisible perimeter flickered. In those moments, disaster didn't need claws or teeth. It could arrive as drought, as sickness, as a slow drift of disobedience that no one noticed until it was too late. Cultures have vanished this way, not in flames but in amnesia. Excavations across the world show the tracers' camps suddenly abandoned, fire pits half-dug, tools left mid-use, no sign of war, no bodies, just a silence that grew too wide. The layers had slipped out of sync, safety had decayed into confusion. It's easy to think such precision is unnecessary now, but every broken circle leaves the same pattern. Once attention fails, everything else follows. And yet, from those failures came reinvention. New forms of vigilance replaced the old ones. Fire became torch, torch became wall, wall became circuit. The circle never died, it simply changed material. The circle never truly disappeared, it just hardened. When people stopped moving with the seasons, they began stacking their fears in stone. Fire became a hearth, then a lamp, then a socket. Dogs turned into gates, alarms, passwords. The warriors took on uniforms and job titles. The elders were replaced by archives memory, outsourced to paper. And later, 2 glass screens glowing faintly like the old embers. What we call progress is often just insulation disguised as achievement. Early walled towns in Mesopotamia followed the same ancient geometry, only with brick instead of bone. The ziggurat stood where the central fire once burned, the gods relocated to rooftops. Guards paced the battlements instead of the tundra. The dogs were replaced by horns, drums, bells, technologies of alertness that echoed the same purpose: to keep the circle awake. Even medieval castles obeyed the formula: warmth in the middle, vulnerability pushed outward, the hierarchy stacked like concentric rings of fear. Anthropologists studying modern urban design have noticed the persistence of that logic. High walls, narrow gates, guarded perimeters. Architecture still speaks the language of suspicion. A city is just a camp that refuses to admit it's scared. Streetlights trace the same perimeter of firelight, bathing danger in orange glow. Security cameras blink like digital dogs, watching for movement no one trusts the human ear to hear. And we, the descendants of those firekeepers, have internalized the geometry. Apartments become microcamps. We sleep, facing the glow of screens, devices humming beside us like silent companions. The light isn't for seeing, it's for reassurance. We tell ourselves it's convenience, but our nervous systems know otherwise. Somewhere in the spinal cord, the old instinct purrs: if there's light, something's watching over you. Even our language betrays the inheritance. Firewalls, security circles, safe zones. We still measure safety in layers, as if danger were a climate pressing inward. The tools have changed, but the psychology hasn't. We protect not just our bodies, but our illusions of control. The ancestors feared claws in the dark. We fear the email we didn't encrypt. The predators evolved, but the anxiety stayed familiar. And at the outermost ring, where once stood the watchful elders and restless warriors, we now place sensors, guards, police agents of vigilance who rarely know the stories behind their tasks. The system works, but it hums without poetry. We've built perfect defenses for a danger we no longer understand, yet we still sleep best when the lights flicker like a campfire. The oldest circle remains within us, humming faintly under all the walls and wires. Every lock, every login, every nightlight is an echo of that primal choreography of warmth and watchfulness. Because, in truth, the human animal never stopped sleeping facing the fire, it just changed what the fire looked like. Even with all our walls, alarms, and passwords, the nervous system hasn't caught up with civilization. Deep down, it still thinks the world is full of teeth. The modern bedroom, sealed, climate-controlled, glowing faintly from a phone screen, is just a sophisticated replica of the old campfire ring. We tell ourselves we've evolved, but the body keeps whispering the truth. Safety is circular, and we are always arranging ourselves around its flicker. The bed sits where the fire once burned. The soft light of a lamp mimics the same wavelength as embers: orange, low, hypnotic. Even the way we drift into sleep, curling slightly toward warmth, follows that ancestral geometry. Evolution didn't bother rewriting the script, it just swapped materials. The instinct to face the source of light remains so deep that experiments show people unconsciously orient themselves toward windows, screens, or candles when resting. Somewhere inside, the brain still believes danger lives behind it. Our rituals are just as revealing. We check the locks, pat the pockets, scroll through notifications, tiny modern equivalents of feeding the fire, counting the dogs, glancing at the horizon. Parents who fall asleep with one ear tuned to their child's breathing are performing the same act as the old centuries. The noise has changed, but the posture of vigilance hasn't. And the mind, that restless archive of older fears, keeps score. It rewards us for patterns of security with a chemical sigh of relief, the warmth of melatonin, the stillness of slowed breath. But when the pattern breaks, a creak in the hallway, a phone vibrating at 3 a.m., the old alarm bells ring. The system that once saved us from predators now startles us awake, because an email arrived too late. Civilization gave us new stimuli, not new wiring. Anthropologists sometimes speak of ancestral residue, the way certain ancient habits persist, long after their environments vanish. Sleeping facing the light is one of them. So is clustering together in crises, whispering in low tones, seeking warmth when afraid. These aren't quirks of psychology. They're continuations of a choreography that once decided who lived through the night. And so the old layers remain, invisible but intact. The light at the center, whatever shape it takes, still defines the world around it. Dogs, alarms, passwords, elders, memories, all orbit the same glowing heart of precaution. The human animal, clever and fearful, continues to build its safety one circle at a time, pretending it's comfort when it's really history. We don't face the fire because we're civilized. We face it because, somewhere inside, we still remember what waits in the dark when it goes out.